In many ways, Robin actually fits in well with the fictional or not figures we've looked at this month. Queen Mab and Herne the Hunter may have been part of older traditions, but they first make their named appearance in writing via Shakespeare. King Arthur has plenty of legends about him, and if he did exist, then links between the historical reality and the legends are clearly tenuous. Robin, however, is almost entirely fictional. Ronald Hutton even explained as much in a talk he gave to the last Tuesday's Society. It seems the stories about Robin can also be found about other outlaws. This makes it more likely Robin is a composite figure. That said, this post is unconcerned with whether or not Robin Hood actually existed. I originally wanted to look at how Robin appears in folklore, but then, we have the legends for that. They are the folklore, and after looking into him further, I found an incredibly odd side to Robin Hood, the weird mythical stuff projected onto him. Robin Hood is a legendary heroic outlaw originally depicted in English folklore and subsequently featuring in popular culture, literature, and film. According to legend, customarily set in England during the reign of King Richard I, the Lionheart, Hood was a highly skilled archer and swordsman. In some versions of the story, he is depicted as being of noble birth, and in modern retellings he is sometimes depicted as having fought in the Crusades before returning to England to find his lands seized by the local sheriff. In the oldest known versions, he is instead a member of the yeoman class, that is not a peasant, but not a noble either. Traditionally depicted dressed in Lincoln green, Hood and his merry men are said to have robbed from the rich and given to the poor. When the story is traced back to its 14th century beginnings, it becomes clear that the figure of Robin Hood changed over time. The earliest versions would be almost unrecognizable when compared to the green-clad, bow-wielding Robin Hood of today. This really should not come as a surprise after all, as the centuries passed. The tale of Robin Hood evolved as England itself did so. With each new iteration, the narrative would absorb new characters, settings, and traits until finally becoming the familiar legend of today. Through retellings, additions, and variations, a body of familiar characters associated with Robin Hood has been fashioned. These include his lover, Maid Marian, his band of outlaws, the Merry Men, and his chief opponent, the Sheriff of Nottingham. The latter is often depicted assisting Prince John in usurping the crown from the rightful, but absent, King Richard, to whom Robin Hood remains loyal. His partisanship of the common people and his hostility to the Sheriff of Nottingham are early recorded features of the legend, but his interest in the rightfulness of the king is not, and neither is his setting in the reign of Richard I. He became a popular folk figure in the late Middle Ages, and the earliest known ballads featuring him are from the 15th century, 1400s. Since then, there have been numerous adaptations and reworkings of the story over the ensuing years, perhaps even more so with revivals in popular literature, film, and television. Robin Hood is considered one of the best-known tales of English folklore. Consequently, his name can be found dotted across the map of England, from the Midlands northward, Robin Hood's Cave and Robin Hood's Stoop in Derbyshire, Robin Hood's Well in Barnsdale Forest, Yorkshire, and Robin Hood's Bay, also in Yorkshire. But just because his name has been ascribed to a place does not necessarily prove the historicity of the man himself. Whether someone named Robin Hood ever existed to become the basis for the tales has been debated for centuries. One significant difficulty with any historical research is that Robert was a very common name in medieval England, and Robin, or Robin, was its very common variation in the 13th century. Likewise, the surname Hood, or Hood, Hode, etc., was also fairly common, since it could simply refer to either a person who made hoods, a hooder, or, alternatively, to somebody who wore a hood as a head covering. It is therefore unsurprising that medieval records mention several people called Robert Hood, or Robin Hood, some of whom are known to have fallen foul of the law. There are several documented references to historical figures with similar names who have been proposed as possible evidence of his existence, some dating back to the late 13th century. At least 8 plausible origins to the story have been mooted by historians and folklorists, including suggestions that Robin Hood was a stock alias used by or in reference to bandits. What follows, therefore, introduces the top candidates vying for recognition as the real Robin Hood. The earliest known legal records mentioning a person called Robin Hood, Robert Hod, are from 1226, found in the York Assizes, when that person's goods, worth 32 shillings and 6 pence, were confiscated and he became an outlaw. Robert Hod owed the money to St. Peter's in York. The following year he was named Hobahod, but also came to be known as Robert Hood. Robert Hod of York is the only early Robin Hood known to have been an outlaw. In 1936, L.V.D. Owen floated the idea that Robin Hood might be identified with an outlawed Robert Hood, or Hod, or Hobahod, all apparently the same man, referred to in 9 successive Yorkshire pipe rolls between 1226 and 1234. There is no evidence, however, that this Robert Hood, although legally an outlaw, was also a bandit. It is important to note that, in medieval law, just because someone was proclaimed an outlaw did not necessarily mean they became a bandit, brigand, or robber. Of course, being deprived of the law's benefits and protections most likely led many outlaws to pursue a criminal life merely to survive. In the absence of a definitive historical figure, then the search for Robin Hood relies on English medieval popular culture, specifically folklore, ballads, and poetry. Shortly before Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, one William Langland penned The Vision of Piers Plowman in the second half of the 14th century. Within this Middle English verse is the first reference to Robin Hood, when a poorly educated parson confesses his ignorance of Latin, saying, I con note parfitly my paternoster as the priest it singeth, but econ rhymes of Robin Hood. A rough translation might be, I cannot recite the Lord's Prayer as the priest say it, but I know the rhymes of Robin Hood. As professor of English studies at the University of Oviedo, J. Rubian Valdez Mayares argues, putting Robin Hood's name in an uneducated character's mouth demonstrates that the legend would have been well known to most commoners, regardless of whether they could read or write. Valdez Mayares, 2019. By the 15th century, the legend has developed into the more familiar rebellion against the Plantagenet ruling class. One of the oldest known written ballads, Robin Hood and the Monk, dates to around this time. It is the only early ballad to be set in Sherwood Forest and features one of the best-known members of the Merry Men, Little John. Yet, in this version the villain of the piece is not the Sheriff of Nottingham or Bad King John, but the monk of the title, a corrupt figure who violates the sanctity of the church by betraying Robin to the sheriff. The monk's subsequent murder by Little John and Much, another of the merry men, was justified because of the monk's corruption and the death seemingly accepted by a medieval audience familiar with the brutal and violent punishments meted out to criminals and rebels. Valdez Mayares, 2019. Interestingly, these early Robin Hood ballads begin to show a turning of the tables in which the lower classes are able to punish the upper classes through trickery and violence. It was also in the 15th century that one of the longest ballads, the aforementioned A Little Jest of Robin Hood, appears and spreads across England. This poem provides the first iteration of the notion of stealing from the rich to give to the poor, when Robin says, "If he be a poor man, of my good he shall have some." It is in the jest that Robin Hood is attributed the status of a yeoman of the king. The term yeoman is used in medieval literature to describe someone whose social standing was higher than a peasant but lower than a knight or man-at-arms. Despite his privileged position, Robin misses the forest and chooses to abandon the royal court. The jest has him become an administrator of justice and has him establish a code of conduct to protect commoners oppressed by a feudal regime while allowing the merry men to beat and bind bishops, archbishops, and, above all, the loathed sheriff of Nottingham. In the jest, the type of villains has clearly widened to include more figures at odds with the lower classes. As the legend developed, it reflects the upsets to the social order that beset England from the 12th century civil war known as the Anarchy, through to the Black Death and 100 Years' War with France in the 14th century. The burden on the lower classes eventually led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. By the 16th century, Robin Hood was becoming a fashionable rogue for even royalty and nobility to celebrate. A story from 1510 claims that Henry VIII of England, then barely 18, dressed up like Robin Hood and burst into the bedchamber of his new wife, Catherine of Aragon. Valdez Mayares, 2019. It is also during this period that new characters appear in the story, most famously Friar Tuck and Robin's love interest, Maid Marian. It is thanks to Elizabethan playwright Anthony Munday that the outlaw is reinvented as a nobleman, namely Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, who, having been disinherited by his uncle, flees to the forest to become Robin Hood. Munday was responsible for setting the tale in the reign of Richard I, the Lionheart. This not only pitted our hero against the king's younger brother, John, but setting has become the popular basis for later retellings by subsequent authors. As Professor Valdez Mayares puts it, no longer was Robin Hood a yeoman. He had been gentrified for new audiences. Valdez Mayares, 2019. And finally, there is no clear historical evidence for a real-life Robin Hood, and no one individual can be clearly identified as the inspiration for the character who has been so popular in English culture from the 14th century onward. Drawing on its medieval foundations, the tale of Robin Hood has been repeatedly reinvented for each new audience. The story has transitioned from the earliest ballads and poems to stage plays and ultimately to television and cinema. Each rendition mixes the various familiar elements in new ways, often to reflect the prevailing mores of each age. Each retelling adds a little more to the legend as Robin Hood emerges from or returns to the shadows of Sherwood Forest.